If you like this kind of content, long, slow, deep dives into the characters we grew up watching, subscribe and hit the bell. New videos every week. That's the only ask. Morty Smith is 14 years old, and he has already buried himself. Not metaphorically. He stood over a hole in the ground in an alternate version of his backyard, looked down at his own dead face, his own jacket, his own sneakers, and then shoveled dirt over it. Then he walked back inside and sat down at the dinner table with a family that didn't know yet that the Morty they'd grown up with was gone, replaced by a version from a dimension they'd destroyed together. He ate dinner. That's the moment Rick and Morty earns everything it ever asks of you. Because that scene isn't played for laughs, not really. It's a 14-year-old boy standing at the literal end of everything he knew and choosing to just continue. No speech, no breakdown. He picks up the shovel, he digs, and then he goes inside and passes the potatoes. Most people talk about Rick and Morty like it's Rick's show. Rick is the gravitational center, the alcoholic genius, the nihilist with a portal gun, the most dangerous man in the universe. He's funnier, louder, more obviously philosophical. When people quote the show, they quote Rick. When people write essays about the show's ideas, they write about Rick. This isn't about Rick. Morty is the one who absorbs it all. Morty is the one who keeps going. Every lesson the show teaches, every philosophical idea it drags out into the open, Morty is the one it lands on. Rick has already decided what the universe means. Morty is still figuring it out, one catastrophe at a time, and watching him do that across 7 seasons is one of the strangest and most honest depictions of what it actually feels like to be alive that any animated show has ever produced. So tonight, we're going through it, all of it. Season by season, idea by idea, the philosophy Morty Smith accidentally built, not by reading Nietzsche or Sartre, but by living through things no 14-year-old should have to live through, and choosing, over and over, to keep being the kind of person he wanted to be. Get comfortable. This is going to take a while. Part 1. The Anxious Beginning. The first thing you see Morty do, in the very first episode, is panic. Rick drags him out of bed at 4 a.m, puts him in a spacecraft, and immediately asks him to do something terrifying. Morty stutters. He shakes. He argues, then complies, then messes it up, then argues again. Throughout the whole pilot, he's basically just terrified and compliant in alternating waves, trying to keep up with a grandfather who moves at a speed the universe itself can barely track. That's who Morty is at the start. Anxious, eager to please, bad at school, better at feelings than he lets on. He's a kid who wants to be loved by his grandfather and can't quite figure out why Rick chose him. Because Rick doesn't explain things, and Morty doesn't yet know that the explanation would break his brain. The anxiety isn't played for comedy the way Rick's drinking is. Rick's alcoholism is a constant background joke. Morty's anxiety is just there. It's woven into how he speaks, the stuttering, the repetition, the way he talks himself into things he clearly doesn't want to do. The show doesn't label it. There's no episode where Morty gets a diagnosis, but anyone who has lived with anxiety disorder recognizes it immediately. The constant what-if thinking, the tendency to catastrophize, the way fear of disapproval can override self-preservation instincts. That last one matters. Morty lets Rick drag him into objectively dangerous situations, largely because the alternative, Rick being disappointed in him, feels worse. That's not a flaw in his character. That's what anxiety does. It doesn't perform a cost-benefit analysis. It just tells you which threat feels more immediate, and right now the more immediate threat is Rick's face when Morty says no. The very first season establishes this dynamic and doesn't judge it. The show isn't saying Morty is weak, it's saying Morty is young and scared and formed in a particular way by a family that didn't give him many tools for coping. Beth is emotionally distant, wrapped up in her own issues with her absent father. Jerry is loving but ineffectual, a man whose own anxiety manifests as constant insecurity. There are no adults in Morty's life modeling the kind of grounded, secure selfhood that would help a kid trust his own instincts. Then along comes Rick, who is confident in literally everything he does, even when he's wrong, which is often. Rick never second-guesses himself out loud. Rick never looks frightened, except occasionally in ways he immediately dismisses. For an anxious kid with an anxious father, Rick's certainty is intoxicating. Even if what Rick is certain about is terrifying, at least someone knows something. At least someone isn't also scared. This is one of the most under-examined ideas in the show's first season. that Morty's attachment to Rick isn't just about love or adventure. It's about the way certainty works on anxiety. When you can't trust your own read on situations, you look for someone who seems like they can. Rick feels like solid ground. He feels like the most dangerous possible version of safety, but safety nonetheless. The show doesn't endorse this. It lets you see the problem in it, but it also doesn't condescend to Morty for feeling it. Because that's a real thing that real people do. We attach to confident people when we're uncertain. We mistake conviction for correctness. We let the loudest, most assured voice in the room set the terms of reality, even when that voice is slurring its words and smells like a spacebar. Part 2. Rick Potion Number 9. The World That Ended Season 1, Episode 6. Morty asks Rick to make him a love potion so the girl he likes, Jessica, will fall for him. Rick does it, because Rick does things. The potion works, and then immediately catastrophically fails to keep working, because of course it does. Rick's science is brilliant, but his judgment is garbage. The potion mutates, it spreads. Everyone on Earth, except direct blood relatives of Morty, becomes a grotesque Morty-obsessed creature. Rick tries to fix it, makes it worse. The planet is done, their Earth, their dimension over. Rick's solution: they find an alternate dimension where versions of themselves died at the exact moment the cure worked, and they take their place. New Rick, new Morty, new home, same family, different universe. Their real family never knows. The Morty who started this episode, who was nervous about asking a girl to a dance, is now living someone else's life. The scene where they bury the other Morty and Rick, their own bodies, is 3 minutes long and mostly silent. The music underneath it is gentle and sad. When it's done, Morty walks to the edge of the yard, sits down and cries. Rick just says, "Listen, Morty, I know that was hard for you." That's it. No explanation, no apology. Just acknowledgement that it happened and a suggestion to get back to their lives. What's philosophically happening in this episode is, honestly, staggering for a cartoon. What the show is doing, and doing with more clarity than most philosophy classes, is dramatizing the question of personal identity under the multiverse theory. If there are infinite versions of you, what makes you you? If you can slip from one version of your life into another, and everything looks the same from the outside, what actually constitutes your selfhood? Is it memory, continuity, the choices you've made? Morty's answer in the immediate aftermath is grief. He cries because he knows the answer he's supposed to give. Nothing really changed. They're fine. Everyone they care about is still here. And he also knows that answer is wrong. Something did change. He did something irreversible. He broke a world and slid into a replacement, and no amount of philosophical framework makes that feel okay. This episode is the first time the show gives Morty something Rick can't fix. Rick can build anything. Rick can escape anything. Rick can't give Morty back the dimension they lost. And watching Morty sit with that loss, alone at the edge of the yard while Rick goes inside, is the first real indication that this show knows what it's doing with this character. Because Rick doesn't cry, Rick has a framework for absorbing this. He's been through versions of this before. You can tell from how practiced his movements are, from the way he explains the plan without visible emotion. Rick has already worked out, somewhere in his long and catastrophic life, a way to not feel things that can't be changed. Morty hasn't. Morty is 14, and the world ended because he wanted a girl to like him, and he's sitting in the wrong backyard, next to the wrong house, crying about it. Jean-Paul Sartre once wrote about the moment a person confronts what he called radical freedom. The recognition that they are entirely responsible for who they are, that nothing outside themselves determines their choices, and that this recognition comes with an overwhelming weight. He called it anguish, not anxiety about specific things, but the existential vertigo of realizing you are the one deciding. Morty doesn't know who Sartre is, but he's sitting in that anguish. He asked for something. He got it. It destroyed everything, and the only path forward is to keep going. He goes inside. He has dinner with his family, the replacement family that is also his family, because in every way that matters, they are the same people. And the show moves on, and never fully comes back to that moment, and that's deliberate, because real grief doesn't get resolved in the same episode. It just becomes part of you. Part 3. Nobody exists on purpose. One of the most quoted lines in the show's entire run comes from Morty in Season 1 talking to Summer. Summer is upset. She's discovered that Rick and Morty replaced their real counterparts in this dimension. and she's having an identity crisis about what that means, whether her family is real, whether anything she knows is true. She wants Rick to fix it, or explain it, or at least take it seriously. Rick doesn't. Morty does. He takes her to a window and shows her a street full of people, and he says, "Nobody exists on purpose. Nobody belongs anywhere. Everybody's gonna die. Come watch TV." This line gets quoted constantly, usually with one of two reactions. People treat it as profound wisdom, or they treat it as nihilistic despair dressed up as comfort. The debate misses what's actually happening in the scene. Morty isn't saying life is meaningless. He's saying the premise Summer is using, that there has to be a correct, certified version of reality that justifies her existence, is the wrong premise. She's looking for an external validation of her belonging. She wants the universe to confirm that she's supposed to be here. Morty's point, delivered quietly after everything he went through in episode 6, is that the universe doesn't do that. It doesn't certify you. There is no cosmic office that stamps real and legitimate on your experiences and tells you you're allowed to feel them. You're here and you feel things, and the people around you are also here and also feel things, and that's it. That's all the permission you get. The Come Watch TV isn't resignation. It's an invitation to stop waiting for the universe to hand you meaning and start being present in the life you're actually living. Now, the show knows this is easier said than done. Morty can say this to Summer because, at this moment, Summer needs exactly this specific thing, a brother who sees her and tells her she's real enough. Morty means every word, and also Morty will spend the next 6 seasons still trying to figure out how to actually live by this idea, because knowing something intellectually and being able to hold it under pressure are very different things. This is what separates Morty's relationship to philosophy from Rick's. Rick has conclusions. He arrived at his worldview through decades of experience and decided what the universe means, and he holds that view with the force of someone who is never going to be argued out of it. Rick's nihilism is a finished building. He lives in it. Morty's relationship to meaning is under constant construction. He says something true to Summer. He says it because he believes it, and then the next episode he's panicking about something, and the anxiety is back, and the framework fails. Because frameworks always fail under enough pressure. That's not hypocrisy. That's being human, or being whatever Morty is, which is close enough. Part 4, Anatomy Park and the First Real Sacrifice. Most people remember Anatomy Park as the fun episode, the Jurassic Park parody where everything inside a homeless man's body goes wrong, and Morty has to run through giant intestines. It's one of the funniest episodes of Season 1. It's also the first episode where Morty has to watch someone die because of choices he made. Annie, a character who spent most of the episode running alongside Morty, who had chemistry with him, who was, in the compressed logic of Rick and Morty adventures, someone he cared about. And then she's gone, because the situation got out of control, and there was nothing Morty could do. The episode doesn't dwell on this. There's no funeral. Morty is upset for about 40 seconds, and then the plot moves forward. This is a pattern the show will repeat throughout its run. The rapid accumulation of losses that Morty never quite gets time to process. By the middle seasons, this becomes a defining feature of his character. The weight of all the things that happened that no one ever really talked about. What's worth examining here is what Morty does with that grief in the moment. He doesn't freeze. He doesn't crumble. He keeps moving because the situation requires it. And there's something philosophically interesting in that. The way crisis strips away the luxury of fully feeling things, and how the body and mind continue operating on a kind of triage basis when the alternative is collapse. The Stoic philosophers, Marcus Aurelius, Epictetus, Seneca, wrote a lot about this. Not in the watered-down, Stoic means you don't show emotions, way that gets misapplied now, but in the more accurate sense. Stoicism is the practice of separating what you can control from what you can't, and putting your energy into the former while accepting the latter as it is. You don't get to control whether Annie lives. You do get to control whether you keep moving. Morty doesn't know Stoicism, he's just in survival mode, but the philosophical architecture of his behavior across the whole series is closer to functional Stoicism than to either Rick's nihilism or his family's various evasions. He keeps walking forward, he keeps trying to do the right thing. He fails, he tries again. He doesn't build a grand framework to make it all make sense. He just keeps going. The Stoics would call that virtue, Not virtue in the moral sense, but in the original Greek sense, the full expression of what a thing is capable of. Morty at his core is capable of continuing, and continuing well, and that capacity, battered and imperfect as it is the through line of the whole show. Part 5, Total Rickall and the Problem of Knowing Yourself, Season 2, Episode 4. Alien parasites invade the Smith house. They implant fake memories, pleasant, warm memories of people who never existed. Every time someone remembers something nice about a person, that person turns out to be a parasite. The only way to identify real family members versus fake ones is that the parasites can only create positive memories. Real people, real relationships, have bad memories attached to them too. The philosophical underpinning is vicious in the best way. The things that hurt you are proof you're real. A love with no conflict isn't love. It's a performance. A family with only warm memories attached to it is a fabrication. Reality, the episode argues, includes everything. The joy and the damage and the argument and the repair. Morty's role in this episode is interesting and under-examined. He's the first one to figure it out, or close to the first. And what makes him able to figure it out is that he has bad memories of his family. He can access them. They're right there. He remembers the times things were hard with Beth, with Jerry, with Rick. He doesn't have to search for them. Some people watch this episode and read it as a celebration of trauma. That's not the move. The episode isn't saying suffering is good. It's saying that edited memory, the kind that removes difficulty in order to manufacture only warmth, produces something hollow. The parasites can't create bad memories because bad memories require genuine stakes. They require that something actually mattered enough to go wrong. For Morty, the bad memories are anchors. They tell him who he actually is and who actually knows him. Rick remembers Morty badly, and Morty can verify that, which means Rick is real. Jerry has been genuinely terrible in ways Morty can recall with specificity, and that makes Jerry real too. There's a version of personal identity philosophy running underneath this that's actually quite elegant. Derek Parfit, the philosopher who spent decades thinking about personal identity and what makes you the same person over time, argued that psychological continuity, the chain of memories and personality traits connecting your past and future self, was the closest thing to a genuine answer. But the parasites can fake psychological continuity. What they can't fake is the texture of actual experience, which includes difficulty. The episode suggests that who you are is the accumulated whole of your experiences, not just the good ones. That you are the person who fought with their sister and felt bad about it. You are the person who let their grandfather down and felt guilty. You are the person who said the wrong thing to someone they loved and had to live with that. Morty's willingness to hold the bad memories, rather than edit them out, the way the parasites would, is what makes him himself. It's also what makes him reliable. You can trust someone who knows the full picture of their own life. You can trust someone who doesn't need everything to have been okay. Part 6, The Wedding Squanchers. What Love Actually Costs Season 2 ends with Rick turning himself in to the Galactic Federation to protect his family. This is one of the most genuinely shocking moments in the series. Rick, the man who outsmarts everyone, who escapes everything, who treats the universe like a series of puzzles he's already solved, surrenders, voluntarily, because Beth, Jerry, Summer, and Morty would otherwise spend the rest of their lives as fugitives. Morty watches this happen. The season ends without him being able to do anything about it. What this moment does, philosophically, is reveal something the show has been building toward all season, that Rick's nihilism is partly performance. Or more precisely, Rick has convinced himself that nothing matters, and he's also built his entire life around the one set of people to whom he clearly cannot apply that logic. Rick loves his family in a way that is completely inconsistent with his stated worldview, and the season finale is the first time the show forces that contradiction into the open. For Morty, watching Rick sacrifice himself is destabilizing in a specific way. Everything Morty understood about Rick, the self-interest, the indifference, the constant implication that Morty was useful but not particularly important, gets overturned in one moment. Rick's love for Morty isn't stated. It's proven in the most extreme possible way. This is philosophically complicated because it doesn't make Rick a good person. He manipulated Morty for 2 seasons. He put Morty in danger constantly. He used Morty's brainwaves. His average intelligence? which generates a kind of background hum that masks Rick's genius from tracking devices, which is itself an incredible metaphor for the way people in relationships get used for the comfort they provide to others. Morty is valuable to Rick, partly because Morty makes Rick feel less alone, and partly because Morty literally dampens the signature of Rick's brilliance, and yet Rick surrenders to save him. The philosophical move here isn't to resolve the contradiction, it's to sit with it. Love is not a coherent system. It doesn't simplify into clean moral ledgers. Rick is simultaneously a man who has treated Morty badly and a man who would go to prison rather than let Morty be hunted across the galaxy. Both things are fully true. Holding both of them without collapsing either one into the other is what the show asks of its audience, and it's what Morty will have to learn to do with his grandfather over the next 5 seasons. The philosopher Harry Frankfurt wrote about love as a kind of attention. Loving something means being unable to be indifferent to it, not that you're always kind to it, not that you protect it perfectly, but that it commands your focus in a way that can't be fully rationalized or chosen. Rick cannot be indifferent to Morty. That's Rick's love, expressed in the only vocabulary Rick has. Morty doesn't have this framework either, but he feels the weight of what Rick just did, and it settles into him as a fact he'll be thinking about for a long time. Part 7. The Rickshank Rickdemption. Rage That Looks Like Growth Season 3 opens with Rick destroying the Galactic Federation from the inside out, escaping prison through a sequence of con within con moves, and returning home, only to find that everything has changed during his absence. Beth and Jerry have separated. Morty has spent months without Rick, trying to hold things together, and the absence has done something to him. He's harder, he's angrier. The Season 3 Morty is, right out of the gate, distinctly less soft than the one who cried at the edge of a yard in Season 1. This is read by a lot of the fandom as Morty getting stronger. And in some ways he's more capable. He handles crisis situations faster, he doesn't panic as often or as visibly, but the show is smarter than that reading. The Season 3 Morty isn't becoming stronger, he's becoming more defended, and defended is not the same thing as healthy. Defended is what happens when you get hurt enough times that you start building walls before the hurt arrives. The philosophy of the Stoics is relevant again here, but in a different way. The Stoic ideal isn't emotional numbness. Epictetus didn't recommend becoming a person who can't be hurt. He recommended becoming someone who can be hurt and continue to function, who can feel loss without being destroyed by it. The goal was equanimity, not armor. Morty in Season 3 is building armor, and the armor looks like strength from the outside, which is exactly what makes it dangerous. His family reads his harder edges as confidence. Rick reads it with something closer to unease, though he rarely expresses that directly. The moment that crystallizes this is in Rickmancing the Stone, the Mad Max episode, the second episode of Season 3. Morty and Summer are both violently acting out in response to their parents' separation. Summer joins a violent gang. Morty replaces his arm with a cybernetic battle arm and fights people with abandon. The fighting is cathartic, clearly, too cathartic. Beth and Jerry's divorce is treated, in the early episodes of Season 3, mostly as material for absurdist situations. But the psychological reality of it hits Summer and Morty, without the show ever quite announcing that it's doing this. They're doing the thing children of divorce do, finding external outlets for pain they can't process internally. Summer finds tribe and violence. Morty finds physical sensation, and a way to turn his body into something that can't be hurt. This is grief. It's dressed up as post-apocalyptic adventure, but it's grief. Morty doesn't talk about missing his family unit. He doesn't say out loud that his parents' split is affecting him. He just starts hitting people very hard until the episode ends, and they go home and nothing is resolved. This is one of the most emotionally accurate things the show does, showing the way adolescent boys in particular tend to process emotional pain through physical action, through displacement, through anything other than sitting still and naming what's happening. Albert Camus wrote that the truly serious philosophical problem is the question of whether life is worth living, the question of suicide, of continuation, of why we keep going when going is hard. He called this the absurd, the collision between the human desire for meaning and the universe's complete silence on the matter. His answer wasn't despair. It was revolt, the active daily choice to continue in spite of the silence. Morty's violence in Rickmancing the Stone is a version of this. He's not suicidal, he's revolting. He's throwing himself into sensation, because sensation is evidence that you're still here, that things still happen to you, that the world is still real even when it stops making sense. The show lets this happen without wrapping it in a lesson. No one sits Morty down and explains what he's doing. Rick watches it with something complicated on his face and says nothing. Summer and Morty never directly discuss the divorce with each other in this episode. The pain just radiates, unaddressed, and you feel it as a viewer because you've felt it yourself or watched someone you love do exactly the same thing. Part 8, Pickle Rick. What Avoidance looks like Season 3, Episode 3. Beth, Summer, and Morty have a therapy appointment. Rick turns himself into a pickle to avoid going. The therapist, Dr. Wong, played by Susan Sarandon, one of the best characters in the show's history, eventually gets Rick in her office, anyway after his day, as a pickle goes predictably insane. And what follows is one of the most direct pieces of genuine psychology the show has ever done. Dr. Wong does not let Rick win the rhetorical game. Rick tries every move: condescension, intellectual superiority, deflection, grandiosity. Dr. Wong just sits there and points at the reality underneath the performance. She tells Rick that his genius doesn't make his coping mechanisms impressive. She tells him that the true sign of his intelligence is that he knows exactly what he's doing and why, and chooses to keep doing it anyway because the alternative, feeling things, is the one thing his intelligence can't protect him from. Morty watches this happen. He's sitting in the waiting room for most of it, and when the family reconvenes after, the episode doesn't give him a monologue about what he learned. He just saw it. He saw Rick cracked open by someone who refused to let the cleverness serve as armor. What this moment does for Morty's arc is less about what he says, and more about what gets deposited into him. He's been watching Rick for 3 seasons now. He's absorbed Rick's framework for the world, the irony, the certainty, the casual nihilism, without quite being able to apply it cleanly, because Morty isn't Rick. And here is someone demonstrating in real time that Rick's framework is also a cage, a very sophisticated cage, but a cage, Dr. Wong says something in that session that gets quoted often, but not always examined carefully. She says that the real reason Rick doesn't want to go to therapy, or to family therapy, is that it would undermine his position as the one person in the room who doesn't need anything. That self-sufficiency is Rick's identity. Needing something, needing people, needing warmth, needing to be told you're loved, would threaten the whole structure. This is important for understanding what Morty is up against emotionally. He lives with someone whose model of strength is complete self-containment. His mother grew up with that model and has internalized a version of it. She holds her own feelings at arm's length. His father grew up with a version of anxious neediness, which is the other side of the same coin. Neither parent modeled the third thing, that needing people and being capable are not opposites. Morty is trying to figure out, without explicit guidance, how to want things without being destroyed when they don't work out. How to care about people without losing yourself in the caring. How to stay open to the world without becoming raw nerve. This is the philosophical work of early adulthood, the building of what psychologist Erik Erikson called identity, the consolidation of self that allows you to then genuinely connect with others from a place of security rather than desperation. Morty is doing this work in the worst possible conditions, without stable guides, in a universe that is trying to kill him on a rotating schedule. That he manages any of it at all is genuinely impressive. Part 9, the Vat of Acid episode, Choices and Their Weight, Season 4, Episode 8. Morty gets a device from Rick that lets him create save points in his life. Like a video game checkpoint, he can reset to any previous moment, undoing whatever happened after it. He uses it. He lives more recklessly. He takes risks, says things he'd never say, makes choices he'd never make, knowing he can always roll back. And then he falls in love with a girl. A real relationship, the kind that develops over weeks of real time shown in a montage, genuine, sweet, unironic. And then the device runs out of saves, and something terrible happens, and he has to live with it. The episode ends with Rick revealing that the device didn't actually create save points. It just relocated Morty into a different version of his life each time he reset, meaning each save used someone else's continuity. Somewhere, in all those parallel dimensions, there are versions of Morty who died from the risks he took recklessly. And the girl he loved? She exists in one of those dimensions. Her whole relationship with him, from her perspective, was real and permanent. When he reset, he just left. This is one of the most philosophically brutal episodes the show ever produced. And it's framed as a joke at Morty's expense. What it's actually doing is dramatizing something philosophers call moral luck. The idea that our moral evaluations of people depend partly on circumstances outside their control. Morty didn't mean to strand anyone. He didn't know the device worked this way, but the results of his choices were real regardless of his intentions. The deeper move, though, is what the episode reveals about what choices mean when consequences are removed. Morty, with infinite do-overs, became reckless. He stopped considering other people seriously. He stopped treating his own choices as permanent, and the result was that he stopped taking himself seriously as a person whose actions had weight. The relationship changed that. Something about loving her made him start treating each moment as if it mattered, as if it couldn't be rewound. And that's when the device ran out. Aristotle wrote about choices as the expressions of character, not isolated acts, but reflections of who you are and who you're becoming through the accumulated pattern of what you decide. Choices that can be undone don't develop character. They just let you skip the consequences without doing the moral work. Morty's best self showed up when he couldn't skip anything. When the relationship was too real to treat as provisional. The episode is cruel to Morty because it takes that realization and gives it to him alongside the knowledge that it cost someone else. The girl loved him back. That was real. He's the one who left, even if he didn't know he was leaving. This is where the show's philosophy gets genuinely challenging. It doesn't let Morty off the hook with good intentions. It doesn't say you didn't know, so it doesn't count. It says, you became your best self, and it mattered, and now live with the full picture of what that means. Morty does. He carries it. He doesn't get a scene where he resolves it, or explains it, or forgives himself for it. He just adds it to the weight. Part 10. Mortiplicity. The question of which one is real. Season 5, Episode 2. Rick has created multiple decoy families, full copies of the Smith family, with memories and personalities and full inner lives, designed to absorb attacks intended for the real family. The decoys don't know they're decoys. Each one believes it's the real one. And then the decoys start fighting each other. This is a philosophical thought experiment made into 20 minutes of television. The question of personal identity, what makes you the specific you that you are, rather than a copy or a version, has preoccupied philosophers from Locke to Parfit to Chalmers, and the show isn't solving it. It's sitting in the chaos of its impossibility. The detail that matters for Morty specifically. Each decoy Morty believes he is the real Morty. Each one has the same memories, the same fears, the same love for his family. Each one would grieve exactly as the real Morty would grieve if told his family was in danger. The consciousness is real, the experience is real, the love is real, and then they die. Morty's response to watching versions of himself die, repeatedly, across the episode, is a kind of exhausted nausea. He doesn't philosophize about it. He doesn't debate identity theory. He just finds it disturbing in the bone-deep way that encountering your own death in any form is disturbing, regardless of whether the dying thing was really you. What the show understands, and what academic philosophy sometimes forgets, is that the question of identity isn't abstract when you're the one looking at the body. It doesn't matter whether the decoy was really Morty in some technical sense. Morty sees his own face. He sees his own mannerisms. He sees something that loves him and grieves and fights to survive. And losing that, whatever it is a loss. The Mortiplicity episode is the show's most aggressive attack on the idea that philosophical precision about identity can absorb the emotional reality of death. It can't. You can have the clearest view of personal identity theory and still feel sick watching yourself die. The intellectual frame doesn't protect you. What does this do to Morty? It adds to the pile of things he's seen that can't be explained away, things that left marks. The show is not episodic in the traditional sense. There isn't a clean reset at the end of each episode, or at least not in the seasons that matter most. Morty is accumulating. He's carrying more than he lets on, more than the show ever explicitly tallies, more than the people around him think to ask about. Part 11. Forgetting Sarek Mortshall. What Heartbreak Teaches. Season 5, Episode 9. Rick fires Morty. That's essentially what happens. He replaces Morty with two crows and tells Morty their partnership is over. The crows are, in Rick's assessment, superior companions. Less complicated, less needy, less likely to make bad choices at critical moments. Morty spends the episode trying to fill the void, running wild, getting into trouble, eventually meeting a stranger who gets sucked into an arm portal in a sequence of grotesque slapstick, while simultaneously, desperately, trying to get Rick back. The heartbreak here is played partly for comedy, but the show doesn't disguise what it actually is. Morty has based a significant portion of his identity and purpose on being Rick's partner. When that's removed, he doesn't know who he is without it. He reaches immediately for replacement, fills the void with sensation, with another person, with anything that will make the absence stop being loud. This is one of the oldest patterns in attachment theory. When the person we're organized around withdraws, we go through something that looks neurologically similar to withdrawal from a physical substance. The anxiety spikes. The need to fill the gap is urgent. The judgment gets clouded because the emotional brain has taken over from the rational brain. Morty, by season 5, should have learned enough to know better. In some ways he has. He's more capable than he was. He handles individual crises well. But the relationship with Rick is his deepest point of vulnerability. And when it goes wrong, the growth recedes and the 14-year-old who just wanted Rick to like him shows back up. This is not a failure of character. This is what being human is. Or again, close enough. You can develop enormous capacities for coping and functioning, and then the specific loss that hits your specific wound will strip the coping away. That's not regression. That's just the wound being visible again. The philosopher John Bowlby, who developed attachment theory, argued that the need for attachment figures, specific people who serve as a secure base from which to operate, is biological, not just psychological. It's not a weakness or an immaturity. It's a fact of what kind of creatures humans are. We are organized around specific people. When those people go, the organization falters. Morty is organized around Rick in a way that has never been made fully explicit, but has always been visible. And Season 5, Episode 9, is the episode where that organization gets tested without the safety net of adventure or crisis. He just has to sit with the Rick-shaped hole and figure out what he actually is when it's not being filled. He doesn't fully figure it out, but the attempt, messy, sloppy, arm portal adjacent, is a genuine one. And when the episode ends and Rick comes back, Morty doesn't dissolve back into the same dynamic. Something has shifted. He's seen what he does when the relationship breaks. He knows more about himself now than he did before. That's the work. Imperfect, embarrassing, slightly covered in someone else's arm fluid, but the work. Part 12, Rick Marai Jack, the Season 5 finale and what evil Morty got right. The Season 5 finale introduces something the show has been quietly building towards since Season 1. Evil Morty's escape. Evil Morty, the Morty who put himself in charge of the citadel of Ricks, who ran it with ruthless efficiency, who was eventually cornered and outnumbered, makes his last move. He builds a device that tears through what he calls the curve, the mathematical boundary that contains the infinite versions of Rick and Morty within a particular pattern of reality. Within the curve, all Ricks and Mortys are connected, trapped in the same relational dynamic regardless of dimension. Evil Morty escapes the curve entirely, stepping out of the pattern into freedom, and what's remarkable is that our Morty in that moment chooses not to follow him. Evil Morty offers an invitation. He tells Morty that the curve is a prison, that Rick built it and maintains it, and that every Morty across every dimension is a version of the same trapped configuration. He tells Morty there's a way out, and he's taking it, and Morty can come. Morty says no. This is one of the most revealing choices the show asks Morty to make. Because evil Morty isn't wrong about the prison, he's identified something real. The pattern of Rick-Morty relationships does seem to be a kind of trap, a dynamic that recycles itself regardless of the specific individuals involved. The Citadel was full of evidence of this. Morty has seen it himself across the series. But evil Morty's escape is solitary. He leaves the pattern by removing himself from all relationship. He gets out of the curve by getting out of everything, out of family, out of love, out of the specific and messy attachments that make you a particular person with a particular history. His freedom is real, but it costs him every connection he has. Morty's refusal isn't naive. He's not refusing because he doesn't understand what evil Morty is offering. He refuses because the thing evil Morty is escaping from, the love, the mess, the weight, is also the thing that makes the whole enterprise mean something. The philosopher Simone de Beauvoir wrote about freedom not as the absence of connection, but as the capacity to act within connection, to be genuinely yourself even in relation to others. She argued that the kind of freedom that requires isolation, that can only exist in the absence of others, is not real freedom but a kind of flight. Real freedom takes place in relation. Morty, without having read de Beauvoir, chooses relation. He stays in the curve. He stays with Rick. He stays with all the difficulty and damage and love of a family that is broken in specific and familiar ways. Evil Morty watches him make that choice, and the look on his face, and it is a look, because the show is good enough to animate it, contains something you could almost read as respect, and something you could also almost read as pity, and you never quite know which one is right. Maybe both. Maybe the show is saying both are right. Maybe the choice to stay in the mess is both brave and a kind of resignation, and the only honest thing is to hold both of those at once. Morty can do that now. That's the growth. Not that he's solved anything, but that he can look at the honest complexity of his own situation and stay in it anyway. Before part 2, take a breath. Get comfortable again. What we've covered so far is the foundation, who Morty was, what the show built him out of, and the specific pattern of experiences that shaped his relationship to meaning. He started as a kid with anxiety, who attached himself to a man who seemed to have all the answers, and then spent 5 seasons discovering that the answers were real and also insufficient, that Rick was brilliant and also broken, and that the universe is large enough to contain both of those truths without resolving them. The philosophical tradition that maps most cleanly onto Morty's situation isn't nihilism. That's Rick's territory. It isn't purely existentialist, though Morty has his Sartrean moments. The closest fit is something you could call practical absurdism, the daily, untheorized practice of choosing to continue and choosing to care, even when the caring makes no rational sense. Camus described the absurd hero as someone who keeps walking even after acknowledging the cliff. Morty is that, but without the acknowledgement. He keeps walking because stopping is worse, because the people behind him matter, because whatever meaning there is lives in the doing rather than in any conclusion about whether doing matters. He's also still 14, emotionally, in the ways that count. That's the part the show never lets you forget. All this philosophy, all this growth, all this weight, and he still gets a crush on a girl and can't talk to her. He still wants his grandfather to be proud of him. He still flinches when people raise their voices. That's not irony. That's accuracy. People don't stop being who they fundamentally are just because they've been through hard things. You can carry enormous weight and still be moved by small kindness. You can have stared into the void and still need someone to tell you, you did a good job. Morty needs that. He still does, even in season 7. And the show doesn't read that as failure, neither should we. The philosopher William James, one of the founders of American pragmatism, a school of thought that cares less about what's abstractly true and more about what works in actual lived experience, wrote that the greatest use of a life is to spend it on something that outlasts it. James wasn't being sentimental about legacy or fame. He was making a structural argument about meaning. That meaning is created by directing attention and effort towards something larger than the immediate moment. Morty does this without knowing he's doing it. Every time he argues with Rick about saving someone who doesn't need to be saved, every time he insists on going back for a stranger, in a situation Rick would calculate as not worth the effort, he is directing attention towards something larger. He is insisting, in the only language he has, that individual lives matter even when the math says they don't, that the stranger is worth the cost, that the good move and the efficient move are not always the same move. This is not a position Rick shares. Rick calculates. Rick optimizes. Rick leaves people behind when the calculation says to leave them, and he doesn't lie awake about it later, or if he does, he doesn't show it. Morty lies awake. You can tell. The show doesn't show you the nights, but you can read them in the mornings, in the slight dark under his eyes, in the way his anxiety spikes faster after certain kinds of adventures, in the way some subjects make him go quiet in ways that have nothing to do with not knowing what to say. He carries the nights. He carries the weight of the choices and the losses, and the things that happened that no one ever officially acknowledged. and he keeps showing up. James would call that a life well aimed, regardless of whether the universe is paying attention. Morty hasn't solved anything. He hasn't reached a conclusion. He's just still going, still caring, still refusing to treat the people around him as math. That refusal costs him too, it's worth saying plainly. Morty's insistence on caring, on extending empathy to beings and situations that Rick would categorize as not worth the energy, that insistence creates debt, emotional debt, physical risk, the kind of exposure that comes from not hiding behind a calculated distance. He gets hurt. He keeps getting hurt. The show doesn't spare him, just because his instincts are better than Rick's. But there's something on the other side of that cost. People like Morty, in fiction and in life, are what make the world survivable. Not impressive, survivable. The genius is useful. The philosopher is interesting. The person who simply will not stop caring about the stranger in front of them, even when caring is exhausting, even when caring is stupid, even when the universe is loudly communicating that caring is a waste of resources, that person is necessary. The world holds together around them in ways that don't get written about, don't get theorized, don't get turned into monuments. After 7 seasons, that refusal is his philosophy. Unwritten, unspoken, never labeled, just lived. Get some sleep. End of Part 1. Part 2 continues with Seasons 6 and 7. Rick Prime, the anatomy of grief without closure, and what happens to Morty when the mission finally has a name. Part 3 covers the philosophical architecture of the whole series, what the show ultimately says about consciousness, continuity, and what it means to keep choosing to be decent in a universe that will never once confirm that it matters. Fall asleep to the philosophy of Morty script, Part 2 of 3 8,000 words. Where we left off by the end of Season 5, Morty had declined an invitation to leave everything behind. Evil Morty tore a hole in the boundary of the Rick-Morty relational pattern, stepped through it, and was gone. And Morty stayed, not because he didn't understand what was being offered. He stayed because the mess, the family, the damage, the love, was the thing he was choosing, consciously, with full knowledge of what he was turning down. That choice is the hinge between the first half of the show and the second. Before it, Morty's goodness was more instinctual than chosen. He was kind because he was built that way, because anxiety makes you eager to be liked, because the world hadn't yet handed him enough reasons to stop caring. After it, his goodness starts becoming something else. A position, a stance taken with eyes open. Season 6 is where the show tests that stance under the worst possible conditions. Part 13, Solarix. The return of everything. The Season 6 premiere does something structurally unusual. It resets the portal gun, stranding Rick and Morty in wrong dimensions. Rick ends up in the dimension that was destroyed in Season 1, the Cronenberg dimension, the world that ended because Morty wanted a girl to like him. Morty ends up in his original dimension, his original home. Pause on what that means. The original Morty, the one from the Cronenberg world, died off-screen in the chaos of that episode. Our Morty, the one we've followed, slid into a replacement life. His original home has been without him for years. Beth and Jerry and Summer, in the original dimension, have been living through the Cronenberg apocalypse without the real Morty, or without what would have been him. When Morty arrives, he finds his original father, Rick Prime, the Rick who abandoned Beth, the Rick who is, in some cosmic sense, the engine of everything. The reason this particular Morty and this particular Rick ended up together in the first place. The episode is dense with plot mechanics, but what matters philosophically is the emotional texture of Morty coming home to a home that was never quite his. The original dimension has his scent on it, the memories, the layout of the house, the family history that was his before the switch. And it's wrong. It feels wrong in the specific way that returning to a place you've changed feels wrong when you realize you've become someone the place doesn't recognize. This is a phenomenon philosophers working on identity have gestured at without quite naming cleanly. You are continuous with your past self, but you are not identical to it. The 7 years older version of you, who goes back to the childhood bedroom, finds it smaller, stranger, quieter. The relationship between who you are and where you came from is real but not simple. Morty in his original dimension is someone encountering the first version of his own life from the outside. He doesn't philosophize about it. He moves through it. He solves the immediate problem. He comes back. But the encounter with Rick Prime, the architect of everything, seen up close for the first time, lands in him with weight the episode doesn't rush to process. Rick Prime killed Rick's family. Not this Rick's family. Rick C-137's original family. That's why Rick C-137 became the Rick we know. Not originally a traveling scientist, but a man looking for revenge, building a portal gun to find the person who destroyed what he loved. Rick's nihilism has a biography. And Morty, after 6 seasons of living with that nihilism, now knows where it came from. This matters for the philosophy of the show in a specific way. Morty has absorbed a worldview from Rick. He's been shaped by a man whose bitterness and brilliance came from particular losses. Knowing those losses doesn't change the worldview, but it does change what it means to hold it. If nihilism is partly a grief response, it's something different than if it's pure conclusion. Morty now has to sit with the knowledge that some of Rick's most certain pronouncements about the universe came from a man whose certainty was calcified pain. That's a difficult thing to know about your teacher. Part 14, Bethic Twinstinct, What We Inherit Without Asking, Season 6, Episode 3. The episode is mostly about Beth and Space Beth, the clone of Beth that Rick created in Season 4, to solve the problem of Beth having to choose between her family and her desire for adventure. Space Beth went out into the universe. Regular Beth stayed home. Now they're in the same house, and increasingly attracted to each other, which the show plays with maximum comic willingness. But Morty's thread in this episode is quieter and worth sitting with. He watches his mother, both versions of her, and the thing you see on his face in the background of several scenes is something the show doesn't name. He's watching someone he loves navigate a version of the same split he's been living for years. Beth wanted 2 things that seemed incompatible. She got both sort of, through a workaround that created its own problems. Morty has been trying to figure out how to be both the person Rick needs him to be and the person he actually is, and those have never fully lined up. The philosophical territory here is what psychologists call identity foreclosure. When you lock into an identity early, usually because someone important to you needs you to be a certain way, and the locked version gradually diverges from who you're becoming. Beth foreclosed on mother and surgeon when she was young, pushed there partly by Rick's absence and partly by the pressure of her own fear. Morty foreclosed on Rick's Morty before he had enough information about either Rick or himself to make that choice well. Watching both Beths exist simultaneously, the one who stayed and the one who left, gives Morty a strange lens on his own situation. He chose to stay. In the Season 5 finale, facing evil Morty's exit, he chose to stay in the curve, in the relationship, in the mess. He made that choice consciously. But watching his mother's 2 versions interact, he starts to feel the cost of all the choices not taken. Not with regret, exactly, more like awareness. This is what adulthood actually feels like, once the anxiety of early adolescence starts to thin out a little. You stop wondering what you should want and start noticing what you chose, and feeling the shape of what those choices ruled out. The psychologist James Marcia built on Erickson's work to describe this as identity achievement, the state of having actively explored options and committed to a path, as opposed to simply inheriting one. Morty is working toward that, slowly, badly, in between dimension-hopping crises and whatever Rick needs this week. The Beth episode is a minor one in terms of plot, but Morty's quiet watching is the kind of character work the show does best. Not announced, not explained, just visible in the background of someone else's story. Part 37. Why he keeps going. Last question. The last one, because it's the only question that leads anywhere useful when you've been lying in the dark thinking about all of this. Why does Morty keep going? Not why does he survive. Survival is mostly external, mostly the universe and Rick and luck. Why does he keep choosing to be the person he is, keep showing up with the moral effort intact, keep refusing the philosophical frameworks that would make the losses hurt less and the choices feel lighter? The honest answer is that the show doesn't give you a reason. There's no speech. There's no moment where Morty articulates a theory of why being decent in an indifferent universe is worth it. The show has been careful about this. Deliberate, disciplined, never letting him say the thing because the thing isn't sayable. You don't have reasons for your deepest commitments. You have the commitments. The reasons come later, if at all, as justifications rather than causes. What you can say is what the behavior looks like from the outside, across 7 seasons of evidence. Morty keeps going because stopping would require becoming someone unrecognizable. The caring is structural. It's not something he chose the way you choose a philosophy, it's something he is, in the deepest sense of what it means, when it means the part that doesn't change under pressure. The anxiety changes, the courage fluctuates, the wisdom accumulates, the caring doesn't change, it's the constant. Camus said we must imagine Sisyphus happy. The line is famous and slightly irritating because happiness is not the point and Camus knew it. The French word is closer to satisfied, or perhaps at peace with the terms of his situation. We must imagine Sisyphus at peace with the boulder and the hill and the rolling back, not because these things are good, but because they're the terms of his existence, and the only alternative is a different kind of death. Morty is at peace with the terms, not cheerfully, not philosophically, in the bone-deep way of someone who has tested every other option and found them wanting. He tried the armor in season 3 and it didn't fit. He tried the distance in various smaller ways and always ended up back in the room. He was offered the exit by evil Morty and turned it down. What he's left with is the terms, anxiety and love and grief and courage, and the specific, irreplaceable people he somehow ended up responsible for, not by formal agreement but by the logic of having cared about them long enough that the caring became a kind of ownership in both directions. He owns them. They own him. That's the curve from inside. And inside the curve, it's enough. Not more than enough. Not a triumph. Not the answer to the hard problem or the solution to the absurd or a refutation of Rick's nihilism. Just enough. Just the daily, accumulating, grinding enough of a life that keeps choosing to be in relation, to carry the weight, to go back. That's what 14 years of catastrophe built. One person who keeps going for reasons he couldn't articulate, but lives every day, in the full and unglamorous weight of them. Get some sleep. Part 15. Analyze Piss, the failure mode of coolness season 6 episode 4. Rick gets a nemesis, or thinks he does. A villain called Piss Master challenges him, and Rick's response is to completely ignore the threat, which accidentally leads to Piss Master's suicide. Rick then spends the episode feeling guilty, which he handles by performing indifference until the indifference becomes impossible to maintain. Morty's role in this episode is less about what he does and more about what he witnesses. He watches Rick fail, specifically, at the thing Rick is most publicly identified with, not caring. Rick's whole posture, the shrug, the cynicism, the refusal to assign weight to things, collapses when an actual consequence lands. A person is dead because Rick dismissed him, and Rick cannot apply his own framework to that. The framework says nothing matters, people are replaceable, the universe is indifferent. The framework breaks the moment Rick is asked to actually inhabit it, rather than just perform it. Morty has seen Rick break before. He saw it in Dr. Wong's office. He saw it in the season 2 finale when Rick surrendered. Each time the break reveals the same thing. Rick's philosophy is partly prescription and partly medication. He took a worldview that let him survive unthinkable loss, and he held it so long it started to feel like discovery. But it was always, at its base, a way of not having to feel the full weight of caring about things that might be taken from him. The lesson Morty draws from Analyze Piss isn't spelled out. It never is. But there's a version of it that runs something like, the appearance of not caring is not the same thing as equanimity. Rick looks like someone who has made peace with the universe's indifference. What he actually is, underneath the layered performance, is someone who found a way to pre-grieve everything so the actual loss would land lighter. That's not philosophy. That's a coping mechanism wearing philosophy's clothes. Morty, watching this, is doing the ongoing calibration he's been doing for 6 years of his life. He doesn't want to be Rick. He's never wanted to be Rick. But Rick's framework is the one he has access to, so part of his work is constantly separating what's useful in it from what's just Rick's scar, tissue dressed up as wisdom. The Stoics again, Epictetus was a slave, then a freedman, and what he knew about equanimity came from an actual practice of separating the self from outcomes, not from building walls against feeling. Rick's version of this is the wall. Morty keeps bumping into the difference. Part 16, Jurassic Mort. The Problem with Humility Season 6, Episode 5. Dinosaurs return to Earth. They're brilliant, benevolent, and better than humanity at essentially everything. They solve climate change, disease, geopolitical conflict, resource distribution, in about 48 hours. Humanity's response is to feel terrible about itself. Rick's response is to feel competitive and eventually engineer a situation that forces the dinosaurs to leave by making Earth's problems too complicated for their good faith problem-solving approach. Morty's thread is the most honest one in the episode. He goes through several phases: awe at the dinosaurs, then relief that things are getting fixed, then a quiet discomfort he can't name, then the beginning of something like anger. The discomfort is worth examining. When the dinosaurs fix everything, they remove the stakes from human effort. Morty's entire existence has been built around trying to help, trying to do the right thing, trying to be good in situations that are hard. The dinosaurs make trying irrelevant. They are so competent that human virtue becomes decorative. You don't get credit for kindness in a world where the problems kindness addresses have already been solved by beings who can solve them 10 times faster. This is a philosophical problem that gets called, in various forms, the demandingness objection to consequentialism. If the right action is always the one that produces the best outcome, and someone else can always produce better outcomes than you, your moral contribution approaches zero regardless of your intent. The framework collapses personal virtue into irrelevance. Morty doesn't frame it this way. He just feels it as wrongness. There's something wrong about a world in which his choices don't matter because better choices are being made automatically. And that wrongness points at something real. The value of moral effort is not reducible to its outcomes. The trying matters. The choosing matters. Not because it's efficient, but because it's the mechanism through which you become a person rather than just a location where good or bad things happen. Aristotle's ethics are about exactly this. Virtue, for Aristotle, is not a state you achieve. It's a practice, something expressed through repeated choices made under pressure, in conditions where the choice isn't obvious. A world that removes the conditions for virtue, removes the possibility of virtue, regardless of how pleasant the results are. Morty's discomfort with the dinosaurs is Aristotelian in its bones, even though Morty has never opened the Nicomachean Ethics, and probably never will. The episode resolves with the dinosaurs leaving, partly through Rick's engineering, and Morty, watching them go, doesn't look entirely relieved. He wanted his choices to matter. They matter again. And the cost of that is that the world's problems are back, and people will suffer, and the math is worse without the dinosaurs. He chose, or accepted, a world with worse outcomes in order to be in a world where his choices mean something. That's a morally complex position that the show doesn't clean up. It sits there. The episode ends. The suffering returns. Morty gets to be the kind of person he wants to be, and the universe is worse for it, technically, and he has to live in that tension without an answer. Part 17. A Rick and King Mortar's Mort, The Fantasy of Competence Season 6, Episode 7. Morty gets pulled into a medieval fantasy world where he's prophesied to be a great knight. He leans into it. He does the training, adopts the posture, becomes, briefly, absurdly, the hero the prophecy describes. The episode is deliberately silly, but there's a serious current underneath it. Morty has spent 6 seasons being the person who is not competent. He's the sidekick. He's the emotional center, the moral compass, the one who cares, but he is consistently and explicitly not the smartest or most capable person in any room that contains Rick. His identity as Rick's Morty is partly defined by what he isn't: a genius, a scientist, someone who has the answers. In the medieval world, that hierarchy dissolves. Rick's intelligence is irrelevant to a sword fight. Rick's portal gun is useless in a world that doesn't run on physics Rick understands. And Morty, who has survived enormous amounts of physical danger across 6 seasons of increasingly extreme adventures, turns out to be genuinely capable in this context, not by Rick's standards, by his own. The fantasy isn't just power, it's recognition. People in the medieval world see Morty and believe he can do the thing. There's no Rick standing nearby who can do it better and faster, and with less emotional investment. Morty is just enough, more than enough, the right person for this specific situation. This is not a trivial thing to feel. The psychologist Alfred Adler built an entire theory of personality around what he called the inferiority complex, the sense, developed in childhood through repeated experiences, of being less capable than the adults around you, that you are fundamentally insufficient. Adler's argument was that the drive to overcome this feeling is one of the central engines of human motivation. We spend enormous energy trying to prove, to ourselves and others, that we are adequate, Morty's attachment to Rick is, among other things, an Adlerian dynamic. He is adequate enough to be useful to someone who is never inadequate at anything. His worth is defined in relation to Rick's worth. In the medieval world, the relation is inverted, and Morty gets a glimpse of what it would feel like to be adequate on his own terms. He can't stay, of course. The episode returns him. Reality reasserts itself. But the glimpse is real, and it deposits something. A small internal argument that Rick's Morty is not the only thing he is, even if it's the thing he's currently organized around. Part 18. Ricktional Mortpoon's Rickmas Mortcation. Grief Without a Map Season 6. Episode 10. The Season 6 Christmas special is the episode where Rick Prime's shadow becomes impossible to ignore. Rick C-137 has been hunting Rick Prime since we learned the biography, The Murdered Family, the reason Rick became Rick. In this episode, the hunt lands in a specific, brutal place. What happens to Morty in this episode is less about plot and more about being in the room when someone else's grief goes wrong. Rick, for 6 seasons, has given Morty a particular kind of emotional education. The education says, feelings are information, but they're also liabilities. You acknowledge them and move. You don't live in them. You don't let them make your decisions. You get the lesson and you continue. The Christmas special reveals the flaw in that education. Rick's grief over his original family is not processed. It has been weaponized, turned into the hunt for Rick Prime, into a mission structure that lets him feel purposeful rather than devastated. Grief is supposed to move through you. Rick converted his into fuel, and fuel burns. It doesn't resolve. Morty watches the cost of this. He has spent 6 years being shaped by a man who turned the worst loss of his life into a project, and he's starting to see what that project is actually doing to Rick, and, by extension, what it has been modeling for Morty about how you're supposed to handle the unbearable. The philosopher Thomas Nagel wrote about what he called the absurdity of human life, not in Camus' sense of cosmic meaninglessness, but in the more local sense of the gap between the enormous weight we assign to our own experiences and the external viewpoint from which those experiences look small and contingent. Grief is one of the places where that gap collapses. When someone you love is gone, there is no external viewpoint that makes it small. It is enormous, all the way down. Rick tried to skip grief by converting it. The Christmas special is the first time the show lets you see the conversion failing. Not dramatically, not in a speech, but in Rick's face and in the quality of his silences, in the way he keeps moving even when staying still might be the only honest thing to do. Morty takes this in. Morty, who has lost things across 6 seasons and mostly kept moving because that's what Rick modeled, is looking at the man who taught him to keep moving and seeing the cost of never stopping. He doesn't know what to do with that yet. He's still very young, emotionally, in the ways that matter. But the image is there, filed away with all the other images the show has given him, that don't get processed in the episode they appear in. Part 19. Season 7. The Rick Who Was Always There. Season 7 changes the show in a structural way. The recast of Rick and Morty following Justin Roiland's departure meant new voice performances, but also, and this is the part that gets under-examined, a slight tonal shift in how the characters relate. The new Rick is slightly softer around the edges without being less dangerous or less funny. It's subtle, but it changes the dynamic in ways that are philosophically interesting. For Morty specifically, Season 7 feels like a loosening, not a resolution, a loosening. Like something that has been pulled tight for 6 years relaxes by about 15%, which is enough to notice. Rick Prime is dead by the start of Season 7. The hunt is over. Rick C-137 got what he was looking for, and the result was not what he expected. Not relief, not closure, not the feeling of a wound finally addressed. Just the end of a chase, which turned out to be a different thing entirely from what he needed. This is one of the oldest lessons in grief literature, and one of the hardest to absorb before you experience it. Closure is not a real thing. The word describes something people want to exist. A moment when loss becomes sealed, when the person or thing you lost becomes the past rather than the open wound. It doesn't happen. What happens instead is that time changes the relationship between you and the loss. The wound doesn't close. It becomes part of the landscape. You navigate around it rather than through it, and eventually you stop noticing every time you navigate. Rick, having killed Rick Prime, has to face this. The structure that organized his last decades is gone, and the grief underneath it, The grief the mission was containing is still there, still unaddressed, still the same grief it always was. For Morty, watching this is a different kind of education than anything the previous 6 seasons offered. He has watched Rick be brilliant. He has watched Rick be wrong. He has watched Rick be cruel and generous and cowardly and brave in ways that don't resolve into a coherent moral picture. Now he's watching Rick be lost, not philosophically lost, not wrestling with meaning, just lost in the way a person is lost when the organizing structure of their life disappears, and they have to figure out who they are without it. This is information Morty files under himself. He too has an organizing structure. He is Rick's Morty. Rick chose him. Rick sacrificed his freedom for him. Rick's regard for Morty is the deepest external anchor of Morty's sense of his own worth. And somewhere in watching Rick's mission structure collapse, Morty is sitting with the question of what happens if that anchor breaks. Not because Rick will abandon him. The evidence is against that, strongly. But because the question is worth sitting with. What is Morty without being Rick's? He doesn't have an answer. Season 7 doesn't give him one. It just puts the question more visibly on the table, and the table has been there the whole time. Part 20, that's Amorte. The Ethics of Joy, Season 7, Episode 2. An Italian chef introduces a dish made from interdimensional creatures that produce a euphoric soup when they die. The soup is the most pleasurable food anyone has ever consumed. It also requires killing a sentient being to make it. The episode is framed as a comedy about addiction and complicity, but what Morty does with it is worth attention. He eats the soup, he enjoys it, he learns what's in it, feels sick, resolves not to eat more, then eats more, then goes through several cycles of this. The show doesn't let him land easily on either side. He's not the voice of pure principle who refuses from the start. He's not the amoral hedonist who decides the pleasure justifies the cost. He's a person who knows something is wrong and keeps doing it anyway, which is closer to the actual texture of most ethical failure than either of the cleaner positions. Philosophers call this akrasia, weakness of will, acting against your own better judgment. Aristotle described it. Plato worried about it, and it's been a central problem in ethics ever since, because it reveals that knowing the right thing and doing it are not the same mechanism. You can be fully persuaded that you should not eat the soup and still eat the soup. The knowledge doesn't automatically produce the behavior. This is uncomfortable because we want moral failures to be failures of understanding. We want to believe that if someone just knew enough, saw clearly enough, they would make better choices. The evidence, both philosophical and psychological, is against this. People act badly in full possession of knowledge that the action is bad. Morty's soup cycles are a miniature dramatization of this, played for dark comedy but accurate underneath it. What the episode also does is resist the easy resolution of disgust. Morty doesn't stop eating because the revulsion finally wins. He stops, or starts stopping, because of a different mechanism. He starts thinking about the specific creature dying, rather than the abstract wrongness of the practice. Personalization changes the moral calculus in a way that abstract principle doesn't. The named, particular being is harder to harm than the unnamed category. This tracks with psychological research on moral motivation. People are moved by particular suffering in ways they are not moved by statistical suffering. One story of one person produces more charitable giving than statistics about millions. Morty's brain works this way too. He can hold the abstract knowledge that this is wrong and keep eating. He starts stopping when the wrong thing becomes specific. It's not a clean lesson. He doesn't become a person who only ever makes choices from pure principle. He becomes a person who knows one thing about himself. The abstraction doesn't reach him the same way the particular does. That's information. Imperfect, slightly humiliating information about how his moral psychology actually operates. You can work with information like that. You can't work with a story about yourself, where you are principled and consistent, and the facts don't get in the way. Part 21, Air Force Wong. The return of the Honest Room. Dr. Wong comes back in Season 7. She's been a background presence since Pickle Rick, referenced occasionally, never quite shown again until now. Her return is not for Rick's sake, it's for Morty's. Morty, by Season 7, has accumulated enough that he can't entirely keep moving. The Season 5 aftermath, Rick's grief situation, his own quiet questions about what he is without the anchor of being Rick's Morty. It's accrued. And Dr. Wong, who is one of the few people in the show's universe who is simply not impressed by brilliance or cynicism or the performance of fineness, creates the same condition for Morty that she created for Rick in Season 3. She doesn't let the deflections work. Morty's deflections are different from Rick's. Rick uses intelligence. Morty uses earnestness, a kind of eager cooperativeness that sounds like engagement but is actually a way of keeping the most painful material at arm's length. He talks. He's good at talking about the things that are far enough away. The things close to the center stay peripheral. Dr. Wong notices the periphery. She stays with it. What comes out? And the episode is careful not to make this a cathartic breakthrough scene, because those scenes are almost always lies, is something quieter than a revelation. Morty says something true that he hasn't said before. Not a big thing. A small specific thing about what he is afraid of, and who he is afraid of disappointing, and how long he has been carrying the fear that his worth is conditional. The philosopher Paul Ricoeur wrote about narrative identity, the idea that we understand who we are through the stories we tell about ourselves, and that those stories are always being revised, always in negotiation between who we were and who we are becoming. Therapy, when it works, is essentially this: a space to revise the story, to find the places where the telling has gotten stuck and start it moving again. Morty's story has been stuck in certain places. He is Rick's Morty. He is the one who almost ruins everything and then helps fix it. He is the one who cares too much by Rick's standards and too little by his own. None of these stories are wrong, exactly. But they're incomplete, and the incompleteness has been doing work, keeping certain questions answerable, certain fears contained, certain truths at a distance. Dr. Wong doesn't fix this in one episode. She just makes it slightly less frozen. That's what honest rooms do. They don't transform you. They give you a little more room to move in the version of yourself you're already living. Part 22. Wet Kuat Amortican Summer. The Burden of Being Needed Season 7, Episode 6. Rick and Morty stumble into a situation where Morty is genuinely, urgently needed, not as a sidekick, not as emotional ballast, but as the specific solution to a specific problem that only he can solve. Rick cannot solve it. Rick's intelligence is useless here. Morty's particular combination of human warmth and adaptability and willingness to be vulnerable in front of strangers is the thing the situation requires. He does it. He handles it well. Rick watches from the side. The episode is partly a comedy about Rick's discomfort with being useless, and that's funny. But there's a quieter comedy in Morty's discomfort with being needed in this way, with being the capable one, the one who has the answers, the one the situation is organized around. He's not comfortable with it. After 6 seasons of being the person who needed Rick's competence, being on the other side of that arrangement is strange and slightly vertiginous. He keeps looking for Rick to tell him he's doing it right, and Rick isn't equipped to give that signal because Rick is watching something he doesn't fully know how to process. The psychoanalyst D.W. Winnicott wrote about what he called the capacity to be alone in the presence of another. The developmental achievement of being able to sit with yourself in your own competence without requiring constant external confirmation. A child who can only perform for an audience hasn't fully internalized their own sense of adequacy. They need the audience to tell them they exist. Morty has been performing for Rick for years. He has also, across those years, developed real capability in ways that Rick has occasionally acknowledged and more often taken for granted. But the internalization hasn't fully happened. He still checks. He still looks. The competence is real. The internal security around it hasn't caught up. This episode puts him in a situation where the checking doesn't help and the looking doesn't land, and he has to complete the task anyway. He does. And what he's left with afterward is a small deposit in the account of his own self-concept, not a transformation, a deposit. The kind that accumulates slowly and only becomes visible once there's enough of it to see. Part 23. Rise of the Numbericons, the Mortality Paradox. What the show is actually saying about Death Season 7 runs a 2-part storyline involving the Numbericons and a paradox about mortality that is, on its face, absurdist comedy. Underneath it, the show is doing something it's been building towards since Ricksty Minutes. Morty's relationship with death has been one of the show's quietest ongoing threads. He's died in simulations, watched copies of himself die, held his own dead body in his arms, lived through situations where death was the default outcome and survival was the exception. By season 7, he has more experience with death, his own and others, than most people accumulate in a lifetime, and yet he hasn't become numb to it. That's the thing. Most shows would let a character become numb. It's the easier narrative move, the veteran who's seen too much, who can't feel anymore, who has to rediscover his humanity in a final act moment of reconnection. Morty doesn't numb, he accumulates, he gets heavier, the deaths sit with him, and the weight increases, and he just keeps being a person who is affected by loss. He doesn't find a way around it. The philosopher Todd May, writing about death from a broadly existentialist position, argued that mortality is not primarily a problem to be solved, but a fact to be lived with, and that the quality of how we live is shaped by whether we actually allow death's reality to register or keep it at arm's length through distraction and avoidance. May wasn't arguing for morbidity, for constant contemplation of death. He was arguing for a kind of honesty, letting the fact of death inform how you hold the present, rather than treating the present as if it extends forever in both directions. Morty holds death honestly. This is, in some ways, the most exceptional thing about him. More than his courage or his moral instincts or his occasional genuine heroism, he lets it be real. He doesn't philosophize his way out of it or numb himself into indifference. He just lets each loss be what it is, and he keeps going. The NumberCon storyline is funny and strange and typically Rick and Morty in its commitment to absurdist escalation, but it's also, underneath, an episode about how Morty has developed a relationship with mortality that is different from Rick's, less armored, less processed, more human, and in some ways more honest. Rick has theories about death. Morty just keeps meeting it. Part 24, Fear No More. The Fear That Finally Has a Name. Season 7, Episode 8. A haunted house that generates your worst fear. You go in, you face it, you come out. Rick goes in confident, comes out complicated. Morty goes in last. What Morty's worst fear turns out to be is not, by that point in the series, surprising. But the show handles it with enough care that it doesn't feel like a revelation so much as a confirmation. His worst fear is that the people he loves will come to see what he is. The full picture, the anxious and failing and wanting parts, and find him insufficient. That Rick will run the calculation and find the answer wanting. That he will be left with the correct understanding that nothing about him was ever worth the trouble. This is the fear that has been running underneath everything. Not death, not pain, not physical danger, which he has metabolized so thoroughly it barely registers as fear anymore. The one he can't metabolize, the fear of being genuinely, accurately known and found lacking. The haunted house doesn't cure the fear. That's not what haunted houses do, in the show's logic. It makes the fear visible. It gives it a name and a shape and a place in the story Morty is telling about himself. And that, the naming, the locating, is something. Recur again. The revised story begins when you can see the place where the old story got stuck. Morty's old story was that the fear didn't exist, or that it lived only in specific situations, or that it was just anxiety without specific content. Season 7 locates the content. It is the fear of being known and rejected. It is the fear that survived everything else because everything else has been, in various ways, external. This fear is internal. It doesn't get addressed by being brave in dangerous situations. It gets addressed by staying in the room with people who could leave and watching them choose not to. Rick, coming out of his own fear sequence with something complicated on his face, finds Morty coming out of the haunted house. They don't talk about it. The show, predictably, does not give them a scene where the content of their fears is exchanged, and the emotional accounting is done. They just stand next to each other in the aftermath and go home. But Rick knew, or something in Rick registered, and Morty, watching Rick not leave, deposits that into the account too. Part 25. The architecture of who he is 7 seasons in, the philosophical architecture of Morty Smith, is not a system. This is worth saying directly. He hasn't arrived at conclusions. He doesn't have a worldview he could articulate. If you asked Morty what he believes about the universe, he would probably stutter and say something deflecting, and then ask if you wanted to watch TV. What he has instead is a set of practices, commitments that operate below the level of articulation, ways of moving through situations that have calcified from years of being the way he moves. He goes back for people. When the calculation says leave, he goes back. Not always successfully, not without cost, but reliably. The person who can be left behind becomes, in Morty's vicinity, The person who gets at least one more attempt, he holds the bad memories. Total Rickall taught him this accidentally, but the lesson is now structural. He does not revise his personal history into something more comfortable. He holds the difficult parts as anchors because the difficult parts are what makes the story real. He checks himself against Dr. Wong. Not constantly, not systematically, but when the weight gets heavy enough that moving through it by momentum stops working, he goes to the honest room and says something true. He stays in relation. Evil Morty offered him exit from the pattern, from the weight of loving people who will eventually fail him and be failed by him. He said no. He keeps saying no. He stays in the mess because the mess is the only place where the things he cares about actually live. And he keeps feeling the losses, each one, without the armor Rick tried to model. They accumulate, and they're heavy, and he carries them forward, and the carrying is not graceful or stoic or philosophical. It's just the daily, inarticulate act of a person who has decided, without ever quite deciding, just by continuing to show up, that this is worth it. The philosopher William James wrote that the greatest revolution of his generation was the discovery that human beings can alter their lives by altering their attitudes of mind. He didn't mean this in the self-help sense. He meant it structurally. The position you take toward your experience changes the experience. Not cosmetically, actually. Morty's attitude toward his experience is, underneath all the anxiety and the catastrophizing and the fear of being found insufficient, fundamentally one of participation. He keeps participating. He keeps being in it. The position he takes again and again without naming it is that this, the people, the loss, the possibility, the mess, is worth being present for. That's not a philosophy. It's better than a philosophy. It's a life being lived while the philosophy is still being figured out. Before Part 3, you've been here a while now. The intention is that you stay. Part 3 covers the full architecture of the show, what it ultimately does with consciousness and continuity, and the question of whether decency means anything in a universe that has no opinion about it. It covers the later season's treatment of Rick's grief and what that grief tells us about the limits of intelligence as a life strategy. It covers Evil Morty's exit and what his story says about the price of freedom when freedom is purchased with disconnection. And it covers the question this script has been circling since the first section. If Morty keeps going, if he keeps choosing relation and weight and staying in the curve, if he keeps being the person who holds the bad memories and goes back for people, and stays in the honest room when the honest room is available, what is he building? Is it meaning? Is it character? Is it just survival? Or are those things, at the level he's operating at, not as separate as they look? The answer, such as it is coming. If this kind of content is what you come here for, the long, slow, careful dig into animated characters who turn out to have more going on than anyone expected, subscribe. Every week, a new script. Every script, a character who deserves more attention than they typically get. That's the only ask. End of Part 2. Part 3 continues with the full philosophical architecture of the series. The meaning of Evil Morty's escape, what Rick's grief reveals about the limits of intellect as a survival strategy, and the question of whether Morty's choices, unrewarded, unsystematized, accumulated across 7 seasons of catastrophe, add up to something that could be called a life well lived. Fall asleep to the philosophy of Morty script, Part 3 of 3 now 8,000 words, where we left off. By the end of Part 2, Morty had named the fear. The haunted house in Season 7 pulled it out, the fear that lives underneath all the surface anxieties, underneath the catastrophizing and the stuttering and the eagerness to please. The fear that someone who knows him completely will look at the full picture and find it not worth the trouble. He named it. He came out the other side. He stood next to Rick in the aftermath. And Rick didn't leave, and Morty added that to the slow accumulation of evidence against the fear's central claim. That's where we are, 7 seasons in. The fear is named, not solved. The architecture of who Morty is has been laid out section by section. The practices, the commitments, the things that have calcified from years of being the way he moves through the world. What's left is the harder question. What does it add up to? Not in the cosmic sense. The universe, as the show has insisted across 7 seasons, does not issue verdicts. It does not confirm or deny. It just continues, indifferent, enormous, full of things trying to kill you, and occasional moments of grace that arrive without explanation and leave the same way. The question is smaller and more specific. What does a life like Morty's, built from anxiety and catastrophe and love and the daily refusal to stop caring, actually mean? Is meaning even the right word for it? And if it's not meaning, what is the right word? This is where we're going tonight. Part 26. The problem with Rick's answer. Before we can get to Morty's answer, we have to deal with Rick's. Because Rick has an answer. He's had it for decades, and he's been implicitly selling it to Morty since the first episode, and Morty has been buying pieces of it, while quietly rejecting other pieces, and understanding which parts he bought and which he rejected tells you everything about who he became. Rick's answer is, at its most compressed, nothing means anything, intelligence is the only real currency, and the only honest response to the universe's indifference is to be equally indifferent. He arrived at this position through genuine experience, the loss of his original family, decades of watching civilizations rise and fall, the accumulated evidence of a multiverse in which every possible outcome exists somewhere and, therefore, no particular outcome is uniquely significant. He didn't read his way into nihilism, he lived his way there, and the answer works. This is the uncomfortable part that the show doesn't flinch from. Rick's answer genuinely works, in the sense that it allows him to function at extraordinary levels, despite extraordinary loss. He is not destroyed by what destroyed him. He rebuilds, he adapts, he keeps moving at a speed the universe can barely track. The nihilism is not a failure mode, it's a survival strategy that has been so successful for so long that it's become indistinguishable from a worldview. But the show also keeps returning to what the answer costs. It costs intimacy. Rick is close to Morty in the way a person can be close to someone through shared experience while maintaining a fundamental distance from the experience itself. The closeness is real. We've established that conclusively through the Season 2 finale and the Season 5 finale, and every other moment where Rick proves with actions what he cannot say with words. But the intimacy has a ceiling. There is a point past which Rick cannot go, because going there would require feeling the full weight of caring, and the full weight of caring is the thing the entire framework was built to avoid. It costs flexibility. Once you've committed to a conclusion about the universe has to be very insistent to show you something the conclusion didn't account for. Rick's framework is self-sealing. Evidence that supports it gets incorporated. Evidence that challenges it gets reframed as naivety or sentimentality or insufficient data. Morty's framework, being underdeveloped and always under construction, is more permeable. Things get in, they change it, he adapts, and it costs presence. The nihilist is never fully in the room. Part of Rick is always at a slight remove, watching, calculating, maintaining the ironic distance that makes genuine devastation impossible. The room is never quite real enough to hurt him all the way. He doesn't die, but he also never fully lives in the rooms he's standing in. Morty lives in the rooms, that's the difference. He's all the way in. It hurts more, the losses land harder, the fear is realer and more specific and less buffered by philosophical framework, and he keeps choosing it. Not because he's decided that Rick's answer is wrong, but because something in him keeps reaching for the room, keeps wanting to be all the way in rather than mostly in with one foot out the door. Part 27. What Evil Morty actually understood. Evil Morty has been gone since the Season 5 finale, but his exit keeps radiating meaning backward through the series. The more you understand about who Morty is by Season 7, the more Evil Morty's departure looks like a specific kind of tragedy. Not a villain's escape, but a person finding the only exit from a situation that had no better solutions. Evil Morty understood with absolute clarity what the curve was. He understood that the Rick-Morty relationship is not a relationship between two individuals. It's a pattern that replicates itself across infinite dimensions, always producing the same dynamic, the genius and the sidekick, the irreplaceable intellect and the expendable companion, the person who matters, and the person who matters because of their proximity to the person who matters. He understood that every Morty across every dimension was running some version of the same experiment, and arriving at some version of the same result. A Morty organized around Rick, a Morty whose worth is defined relationally, a Morty who, at some level, cannot fully be himself, because being himself would require a kind of separateness from Rick that the pattern doesn't accommodate, and he decided to leave. not to fix it, to leave. What makes this tragic rather than triumphant is what he gave up. The things the curve contains, the love, the specific texture of being known, the weight of particular history with particular people, are not abstract goods. They're the substance of being a person, rather than just a consciousness moving through space. Evil Morty achieved freedom and paid for it with everything that makes freedom feel like something worth having. This is, in philosophical terms, the problem with negative liberty, liberty defined purely as the absence of constraint. Isaiah Berlin, who wrote extensively about the two concepts of freedom, argued that negative liberty, freedom from interference, from external determination, is necessary but not sufficient for a good life. Positive liberty, the capacity to actually do and be and become, which requires not just absence of constraint, but presence of conditions that support flourishing, is the other half of the picture. Evil Morty maximized negative liberty. He shed every external determination on who he was and what he owed. He got out of the curve, and on the other side of the curve, there's nothing in the show's framing that looks like flourishing. There's just exit, freedom from, without freedom to. Our Morty stayed, chose the curve, chose the weight, chose the conditions that constrain him in ways he didn't fully choose and can't fully escape. Chose positive liberty's territory, even though it's harder and more painful, and means that who he is will always be partly defined by who Rick is. That choice is not naive. It's not the choice of someone who didn't understand what evil Morty was offering. It's the choice of someone who looked at both options and decided that the version of himself that exists in relation, in the mess, in the curve, in the ongoing work of loving people who are difficult and damaged and real, is more worth being than the version that exists in pure freedom. Part 28. The Grief Education across 7 seasons. The show has been giving Morty an education in grief that no one explicitly designed and no one explicitly consented to. It happened by accumulation, adventures that ended badly, people who didn't make it, copies of himself that died while believing they were the real thing, a world he destroyed and replaced, a family he watched fracture and partially reassemble, a grandfather whose love was real and whose damage was also real and whose shadow he's been, growing up inside. Most adolescents get some version of grief education. A grandparent dies, a pet dies, a friendship ends badly, a parent loses their job. The losses are real, but they come at a pace that allows something like processing, time between them, adults nearby who have done this before, cultural scripts that say what grief is supposed to look like and how long it's supposed to last. Morty got none of the spacing. The losses came fast, came strange, came in forms that had no cultural script because the forms were interdimensional and impossible, and the only adult nearby was the person who caused a significant portion of them. He learned to grieve by grieving constantly, without a model, in conditions that made stopping to grieve seem like a luxury he couldn't afford. What he ended up with is not what a grief counselor would design. It's functional and strange and specific to him. He holds the losses. He doesn't convert them into something else the way Rick does. He doesn't build them into a worldview the way Rick does. He doesn't use them as fuel. He just carries them, present weight, and walks with them. And the walking is heavier for it, but also more honest. The Jewish philosopher Emmanuel Levinas wrote about what he called the face of the other, the experience of encountering another person's specificity, their irreducible particularity, and the ethical demand that face makes on you. Levinas was not talking about grief specifically. He was talking about the moral weight of other people's existence. But there's something in his framework that maps onto what Morty does with his losses. He keeps the faces. He doesn't abstract the dead into lessons or statistics or fuel. He keeps the specific weight of specific people who were specific and then weren't. Annie from Anatomy Park is not the time Morty learned about mortality. She's Annie, who died, and that happened, and Morty knows her face in the way Levinas means. The demand of her face doesn't disappear because she does. This is not efficient grief. It's not therapeutic grief, in the sense of working through and arriving at acceptance and moving on. It's something older and less organized and more honest about what loss actually does to people who don't defend themselves against it. Morty doesn't defend himself. The faces accumulate. He walks. Part 29. The Summer Problem. What he learned from the person he forgot to learn from Summer has always been the underexamined Smith. She's funnier than she gets credit for. sharper than the show sometimes allows her to be, and her relationship with Morty is one of the most consistently honest dynamics in the series, partly because neither of them is performing for the other the way they both perform for Rick, and partly because siblings, at their best, are witnesses to each other in ways that parents and grandparents can't be. What Summer has given Morty across 7 seasons is less philosophy than evidence. Evidence about himself, offered without agenda. She's seen him at his worst. The Season 3 recklessness, the arm portal era, the periods where the armor went up and the caring went sideways into violence or displacement. She's also seen him at his best, and her capacity to hold both without collapsing them into a verdict is something Morty has absorbed, without naming it. The philosophical concept here is what the psychologist Carl Rogers called unconditional positive regard. The experience of being valued without conditions, of having someone communicate through their ongoing presence, that your worth is not contingent on your behavior in any given moment. Rogers argued this was the central ingredient in therapeutic healing. Not the therapist's wisdom, not the techniques, but the genuine experience of being in a room with someone who is not going to withdraw their regard based on what you say or do. Morty has this, imperfectly, with Summer. She will call him an idiot, she will compete with him, she will roll her eyes, and she will also, reliably, be there, not because she's decided to be, not as a project, just because she is. The unconditional positive regard isn't stated. It lives in the continuity of her presence. He's learned something from this that he hasn't learned from Rick. Rick's regard is real but conditional in ways that have shaped Morty's fear, the deep fear of being found insufficient. Rick's love is proven in moments of crisis, in the sacrifices, in the surrenders. But Rick's day-to-day regard has always had an evaluative quality. Is Morty useful today? Is Morty performing adequately? The bar shifts, the regard fluctuates. Morty keeps checking. Summer doesn't evaluate him. She's just there. And somewhere in the background of 7 seasons of adventures and arguments, that there-ness has done quiet work on the part of Morty that believes his worth is permanently on trial. He's not fully healed of the belief, but it's less total than it was. Summer is part of why. Part 30. Jerry as the unwanted lesson. No conversation about Morty's philosophical development is complete without Jerry, and no conversation about Jerry is comfortable. And that's probably why the show's philosophical commentary tends to skip him. Jerry is a failed man by most conventional measures. He's professionally unsuccessful, emotionally insecure, occasionally cowardly, frequently humiliated, and his relationship with Rick is one of the most unequal dynamics in the show. Rick holds Jerry in visible contempt, and Jerry keeps showing up anyway, partly from love of Beth, and partly from something that looks like an inability to leave a room where he's being degraded. Freud would have things to say about this. Jerry probably knows what those things are and resents knowing. But here's what Jerry also is, and what the show makes quietly clear when it's being careful about him. He keeps trying. Not successfully. The trying doesn't produce results commensurate with the effort. But the trying is real, and it's consistent, and it survives failure on a scale that would break someone with more self-respect. Jerry's persistence in the face of his own inadequacy is not a virtue the show celebrates. It plays it for comedy, for pathos, for the particular discomfort of watching someone refuse to learn lessons that seem obvious from outside their head. But it is a form of continuing that Morty has watched his whole life. The philosopher Harry Frankfurt argued that what matters in a life is not what you achieve, but what you care about. That the quality of caring, the degree to which you're genuinely invested in something outside yourself, is the ground of personal meaning, even when the caring doesn't produce the hoped-for outcome. Jerry cares? Badly and inefficiently, and in ways that embarrass everyone, including himself. But he cares. About Beth, about his kids, about being a person who matters to the people he loves. The caring is real even when the execution is a disaster. Morty has absorbed this, again without naming it. He knows his father is a failure by the metrics Rick applies. He also knows his father shows up. He also knows, in the specific way children know things about parents, that Jerry's love for him is one of the uncomplicated facts of his life. Not earned by performance, not calibrated by usefulness, just there, structural, embarrassing in its obviousness, real. In a life full of love that comes with conditions attached, Jerry's love is one of the places where the conditions are genuinely absent. Morty finds this uncomfortable, in the way that unconditional things are uncomfortable when you're used to earning your worth. And also, somewhere underneath the discomfort, deeply stabilizing, Jerry taught him that continuing without success is still continuing. Morty applies this more gracefully than Jerry does. But the lesson is Jerry's. Part 31. The Consciousness Question. What the show is actually saying about being alive. Rick and Morty has, over 7 seasons, circled around the hard problem of consciousness, without ever quite landing on it directly. The hard problem, philosopher David Chalmers' term, for the question of why there is subjective experience at all, why physical processes produce something it is like to be, sits in the background of almost every episode that deals with copies, clones, decoys, simulations, and alternate selves. Why does it feel like something to be Morty? Not just any Morty, this one, the one we've followed. The show has shown us Mortys who were built, Mortys who were grown, Mortys who believe they are real and are wrong, and one Morty who we believe is real and may or may not be right. What makes the experience of being this Morty different, if anything, from the experience of being a decoy Morty who lived for 3 weeks believing he was the original? The show's answer, offered not in a speech but in the cumulative weight of what it chooses to show us, is probably nothing structural. The decoy Morty's experience is real. The simulation Morty's fear is real. The consciousness doesn't degrade because the substrate is different. What you get is what you get. The experience is the experience, regardless of whether the body producing it was grown in a lab or born in a hospital. This should be destabilizing, and the show knows it. It plays the destabilization for horror in Mortiplicity, for comedy in other episodes, and for quiet sadness in the moments where Morty processes what this means for his own sense of uniqueness. He is not special because his consciousness is different from a copy's. He might not be special at all, in any cosmic sense, and yet, he continues to experience things as himself. The continuity of experience, the fact that yesterday's Morty and today's Morty share memories, share orientation, share the accumulating weight of everything that's happened, produces something that feels, from inside the experience, like a self. Parfit's work again. Personal identity might be less important than we think, but the psychological continuity that produces the feeling of identity is real, and it matters for how we live. Morty's response to the consciousness question is not philosophical, it's practical. He acts as if he's real, because acting as if he's real is the only option that produces a livable life. He acts as if the people around him are real, because acting otherwise would require him to stop caring about them, and stopping caring about them would require him to become someone unrecognizable. This is what Chalmers called the phenomenal stance. Treating the experiences of yourself and others as genuinely experiential, as mattering, even in the absence of proof that consciousness is anything more than very complicated information processing. Morty has never read Chalmers, but he lives the phenomenal stance, all the way down, without irony, without philosophical cover. That's harder than having the philosophical cover. Rick has the cover, the nihilism that lets him treat experiences as contingent, consciousness as a trick, suffering as data. Morty doesn't use the cover. He lets the experiences be what they are, real, weighty, his. Part 32. What decency costs. In an indifferent universe, the show has always been interested in the cost of being good, not in a moralizing way. Rick and Morty is not a show that lectures about virtue, but in the specific, unflinching way of a show that takes moral effort seriously enough to show you what it actually takes out of you. Morty's decency costs him. This has been true from the beginning, but by the later seasons the cost is legible in a way it wasn't in season 1. He's more tired. The anxiety is still there, but it's layered over something heavier now. Not depression exactly, but the weight of sustained caring in a universe that does not sustain you back. You keep giving the moral effort, and the universe keeps not confirming that the effort was worthwhile. And after 7 years of this, the question of whether it's worth it is no longer theoretical. Camus's absurd hero kept walking despite the boulder rolling back, but Camus's formulation was always a little too triumphant. There's something aesthetically clean about Sisyphus that doesn't quite capture what actual sustained effort in an indifferent universe feels like from the inside. It's not heroic, mostly, it's grinding. It's the 3 a.m. version of continuing. Not dramatic defiance, just the decision to get up again, because getting up is what you do. Morty gets up. Every episode, after everything, he gets up. The philosopher Susan Wolf wrote about what she called meaningful lives. Lives that have meaning not because they produce happiness or satisfy preferences, but because they involve genuine engagement with projects and people that have objective worth. Wolf's framework doesn't require the universe to confirm the worth. It requires that the worth be real and that the engagement be genuine. Meaning, in Wolf's account, is produced by the intersection of subjective attraction, caring, and objective value, the thing actually being worth caring about. Morty's caring is genuine, has been from the beginning, will be regardless of how much the universe tries to wear it down. And the things he cares about, the people, the small acts of not leaving someone behind, the insistence on going back when the math says don't, have the kind of worth Wolf is pointing at. Not because the universe endorses them, because they're the kinds of things that hold people's lives together. The kindness that one person extends to another in a difficult moment, without audience, without reward, without even the certainty that it helped, this is the material that actual lives are made of, not the cosmic stuff, the particular. Morty deals in the particular. That's been his philosophical specialty since episode 1, even when he didn't know it was a specialty. He doesn't try to solve the universe's indifference. He just treats the person in front of him as if they matter. Even when Rick's framework says they don't, even when the math says it's not worth the effort, even when he's tired enough that caring feels like lifting something heavy with damaged hands. That's the cost. And that's also the answer to the cost, if there is one. The act of caring is also the act of being alive in the way that makes being alive feel like something. Part 33. The Rick he's becoming by Season 7. Morty is not the anxious 14-year-old who stuttered through the pilot. He's not a different person. He's a more complete version of the same person, with more of the initial architecture visible, and more of the damage visible, and more of the capability visible. He's grown. The growth hasn't gone in Rick's direction. That's worth stating because the show could have gone there. It's the obvious narrative arc, the sidekick who becomes the genius, the student who becomes the teacher. That's not what happened. Morty didn't grow into a version of Rick. He grew into a more fully realized version of himself. What he's developed, that he didn't have in Season 1, the ability to hold complexity without resolving it. He can look at Rick and see both the damage and the love, the manipulation and the sacrifice, the brilliant and the broken, without needing to collapse those into a verdict. Rick is not good or bad in Morty's accounting. Rick is Rick, a specific, particular, irreducible person, whose presence in Morty's life has been simultaneously the best and worst thing about it. Morty can hold that, the ability to stay in the honest room, not comfortably. He never goes to therapy or to the difficult conversation without resistance, but he goes. He's learned, slowly and against his instincts, that the thing he's most afraid to say is usually the thing that needs saying, and that saying it is survivable, and that the room on the other side of the saying is usually more livable than the room on this side. The ability to grieve without converting. He doesn't turn his losses into fuel. He doesn't build a framework that makes the losses philosophically acceptable. He just carries them, and the carrying is honest, and the honesty is its own kind of dignity. The ability to disagree with Rick, not perfectly, not consistently, but when it matters, when Rick's calculation says one thing and Morty's gut says another. Morty increasingly trusts the gut, not because the gut is always right, because the gut is his, and he's the one who has to live with the choices, and living with choices requires having made them, rather than having them made for you. None of this is a dramatic transformation. It's the slow accumulation of someone who kept showing up and kept paying attention, and kept, against all evidence that it would end well, choosing to care. Part 34. The show's actual argument, 7 seasons, is a long time to be making an argument without stating it. Rick and Morty has never stated its argument. The show would collapse if it did. The moment you know what a show is trying to say, it stops being able to surprise you with it, and surprise is the mechanism through which ideas actually land. But the argument is there, and Morty is its primary vehicle, and this is what it is. Intelligence is not a life strategy. Rick's intelligence solves problems, and creates problems at roughly the same rate, and the problems it creates tend to be harder to solve than the ones it started with. After 7 seasons, the most dangerous thing about Rick is not his genius. It's the worldview his genius built. The framework that excuses distance and justifies cruelty and makes it possible to be the most capable person in the universe while failing at being present in a room. Caring is a life strategy, the only one that actually works in the long run, where working means producing something worth having rather than just surviving. Caring costs more than Rick's method. It leaves you open to loss in ways that Rick's method doesn't. It makes the universe's indifference hurt more, not less. And it also produces the only thing that makes the universe's indifference bearable, the experience of not being alone in it. Morty is not alone, not because the universe is friendly. The show has been very clear that the universe is not friendly. He's not alone because he keeps making choices that keep him in relation. With Rick, with his family, with the strangers he goes back for when the math says don't. The aloneness that the universe offers by default is not the aloneness he ends up with, because he keeps refusing it in practice, one choice at a time, without a theory about why. The philosopher Martin Buber wrote about what he called the I-through relationship, the mode of encounter in which you meet another person as a full subject rather than as an object, in which genuine contact happens between two realities, rather than a subject processing an object. Most of our interactions are I-it, in Buber's framing, functional, mediated. We engage with the world as a collection of things to be used or avoided. The I-thou moment is the exception, when the other person's full particularity lands on you, and you land on theirs, and something genuinely mutual happens. Morty lives closer to I-thou than almost anyone in the show. He can't help it. He's incapable of sustained I-it engagement. He keeps noticing the particularity of whoever is in front of him, keeps responding to it, keeps being affected by it. This is the source of his anxiety. You can't be anxious about objects. You can only be anxious about subjects, and also the source of his moral reliability, and also the source of his persistent refusal to leave people behind. It's also what makes him the show's argument. He's not arguing for a worldview. He's demonstrating a mode of being. The argument is in how he moves through the world, not in anything he says about it. Part 35. What 14 really means. The show has been careful, in ways you only notice if you're watching carefully, to never let you forget how young Morty is. He's 14 in the pilot. The later seasons don't give you a clear sense of how much time has passed. The show's relationship with continuity is deliberately loose, and Morty doesn't age in any obvious way. But the implication across the series is that he's been through all of this while still being, in some essential sense, an adolescent. Still in the developmental period where identity is being formed, where the foundational questions are still open, where the person you're going to be hasn't finished arriving. What the show is doing with this is not playing for comedy or shock at the inappropriate situations a 14-year-old ends up in. It's doing something more specific. It's locating all of Morty's philosophical development in the period of life when development is actually happening. Morty is not a formed adult who is having his worldview challenged. He's a forming person who is building his worldview out of whatever materials the universe hands him. The materials have been terrible, catastrophic often, the kind of materials that in real life produce adults who are damaged in specific and identifiable ways, anxious, armored, unable to trust, unable to stay present, unable to believe their own worth is real. And instead, across 7 seasons, the materials have produced someone who is anxious and somewhat armored, and occasionally unable to trust and frequently unsure of his own worth. And also genuinely good, still there, still going back for people, still in the honest room when the honest room is available, still refusing the exits that would be easier and less painful than staying. This is not realistic in a straightforward sense. Real people with real versions of Morty's history often don't come out this well. The show knows this. It lets the damage be visible, lets the anxiety persist, lets the fear run alongside the courage, rather than being replaced by it. But it's making an argument about what's possible under bad conditions, which is different from making an argument about what's probable. What's possible is someone who takes the worst possible curriculum, interdimensional catastrophe, repeated loss, a teacher who is brilliant and broken and models the wrong things with great confidence, and turns it into something worth being, not because the curriculum was good, because the person kept showing up to it anyway. Part 36. The question at the center. At the center of everything the show has built around Morty, There is a question it keeps approaching and never quite answers. Not because it doesn't have an answer, but because the kind of answer this question has can't be given in dialogue or narration. It has to be demonstrated, over and over, in the same way that a person demonstrates who they are, not by saying it, but by showing up. The question is, does it matter? Not cosmically. The show has established, 7 seasons in, that cosmic mattering is not available. The universe has no comment section, no endorsement function. You do not get points for the good choices that nobody witnessed, or credit for the growth that happened quietly in the background of someone else's story. Does it matter in the smaller sense? Does Morty's refusal to leave people behind matter to the people who didn't get left? Does his insistence on the honest room matter to the version of himself who was too scared to say the true thing and did it anyway? Does the grief he carries honestly, without converting it into something more useful, matter in any accounting of what a life is worth? The show's answer is yes. But the yes is quiet and comes without ceremony, and doesn't ask you to trust it before you've done the same work Morty has done, which is to live through enough to know from the inside that it matters before anyone confirms it from the outside. The yes lives in the details. It lives in the way Rick, who has survived everything by feeling nothing, cannot be indifferent to Morty. It lives in the way Summer shows up without being asked. It lives in the way people Morty went back for carried something forward that they wouldn't have carried otherwise. It lives in the way Morty himself, anxious and scared and carrying the full weight of 7 seasons of loss, keeps being the kind of person who goes back. The matter isn't cosmic, it's distributed. It lives in the people who received it and carried it forward. That's the only way meaning ever works. Not from the top down, not from a universe that endorses your choices, but from the side, from the people next to you, who were changed by the fact that you were the kind of person you were. Morty changed people. Changed Rick, slowly, incompletely, in ways Rick would never fully acknowledge. Changed Summer by being the brother who saw her in a specific moment and told her she was real enough. Changed everyone he went back for, in ways the show will never fully tally, because the show is too honest to imply that the tally ever closes. That's the argument. That's what 7 seasons built to. Not a conclusion about the universe. A demonstration in one anxious, stubborn, caring teenager of what it looks like to matter in the only way that's actually available. By being present, by staying in relation, by refusing the exits, by going back. Part 37. Why he keeps going. Last question. The last one, because it's the only question that leads anywhere useful when you've been lying in the dark thinking about all of this. Why does Morty keep going? Not why does he survive? Survival is mostly external, mostly the universe and Rick and luck. Why does he keep choosing to be the person he is, keep showing up with the moral effort intact, keep refusing the philosophical frameworks that would make the losses hurt less and the choices feel lighter? The honest answer is that the show doesn't give you a reason. There's no speech. There's no moment where Morty articulates a theory of why being decent in an indifferent universe is worth it. The show has been careful about this. Deliberate, disciplined, never letting him say the thing because the thing isn't sayable. You don't have reasons for your deepest commitments. You have the commitments. The reasons come later, if at all, as justifications rather than causes. What you can say is what the behavior looks like from the outside, across 7 seasons of evidence. Morty keeps going because stopping would require becoming someone unrecognizable. The caring is structural. It's not something he chose the way you choose a philosophy. It's something he is, in the deepest sense of what it means, when it means the part that doesn't change under pressure. The anxiety changes. The courage fluctuates. The wisdom accumulates. The caring doesn't change. It's the constant. Camus said we must imagine Sisyphus happy. The line is famous and slightly irritating because happiness is not the point, and Camus knew it. The French word is closer to satisfied, or perhaps at peace with the terms of his situation. We must imagine Sisyphus at peace with the boulder and the hill and the rolling back, not because these things are good, but because they're the terms of his existence, and the only alternative is a different kind of death. Morty is at peace with the terms, not cheerfully, not philosophically, in the bone-deep way of someone who has tested every other option and found them wanting. He tried the armor in season 3 and it didn't fit. He tried the distance in various smaller ways and always ended up back in the room. He was offered the exit by evil Morty and turned it down. What he's left with is the terms: anxiety and love and grief and courage, and the specific, irreplaceable people he somehow ended up responsible for, not by formal agreement but by the logic of having cared about them long enough that the caring became a kind of ownership in both directions. He owns them. They own him. That's the curve from inside, and inside the curve it's enough. Not more than enough, not a triumph, not the answer to the hard problem or the solution to the absurd or a refutation of Rick's nihilism. Just enough. Just the daily, accumulating, grinding enough of a life that keeps choosing to be in relation, to carry the weight, to go back. That's what 14 years of catastrophe built. One person who keeps going for reasons he couldn't articulate, but lives every day, in the full and unglamorous weight of them. Get some sleep.